couldn't help but think, wow, there is a lot of opportunity here.
What's been the biggest surprise?
Showed him our prototype. He looked at us and he said, if you develop this, you're going to make everything worse. Don't develop this product.
Sometimes an invention starts with a dramatic moment, but this one began with a Google image search and a picture of a baby who weighed less than a pound. This week, I talked with Eric Chehab, co-founder and previous CEO of Novonate, and now director of business development at Laborie, an engineer who started out studying how adults walk and somehow ended up in a neonatal ICU, staring at catheters held together with tape and ingenuity. What he saw there changed his path. Eric shares how a single class opened the door to a problem hiding in plain sight, how an early prototype almost made things worse, and how a tiny team spent years chasing a safer way to protect the smallest patients in medicine. We get into the near misses, the unlikely investor who appeared in a crowded room, and what it means to build a company around a problem that almost no one sees, except the people most affected by it. All right, well, Eric, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'm really, really excited talking to you today.
Yeah, likewise, David. Happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. So you've had such an interesting journey. Started out working in more orthopedic stuff, working in joints, and now are in the world of some of the tiniest human beings that exist. Maybe we start at the very beginning. I'd love to hear about the class that you were exposed to that sort of led you down this pathway.
Yeah, totally. So as you suggested, I did my PhD at Stanford and studied, I was doing my PhD in the field of orthopedics, studying musculoskeletal biomechanics and knee osteoarthritis and gait mechanics, looking at how people walk. So I spent the majority of my time at Stanford doing that and writing my dissertation and all that, but had the opportunity to take the Stanford Biodesign course in parallel and took that in the second year at Stanford. And for those who don't know, it's kind of an abridged version of the Biodesign Fellowship, consisting of graduate students, so still bringing together, engineers, business students, medical students, or other people in the medical field, just like the Biodesign Fellowship, but in a kind of graduate course level. And took that class, just wanting to dive deeper into this world of medical devices, not really knowing where it was going to take me, and was assigned kind of this broad problem of central line associated bloodstream infections and told to kind of go from there, and eventually kind of drilled down to this world of umbilical cord catheters and the infection rates that come with those, and happy to talk more about how we went from just general infections to umbilical cord catheters. But that was kind of the starting point, and we came out of that class with a basic idea for a product to reduce the risk of umbilical cord catheter infections. Eventually, that kind of morphed into improving their securement and reducing their migration rates. And that was kind of the origin story of Novonate. It wasn't named Novonate for a few years after that, but that's indeed how the story started.
Wow. Well, a whole lot packed into there. What was it like to be in a neonatal ICU for the first time? Tell me about that experience.
Yeah, wild for sure. My first exposure to it was through the world of Google Images, actually, as we were doing kind of research in the class and trying to identify what part of central line associated bloodstream infections or CLABSIs to kind of dive deeper into. And one of the medical students, or we had done some research rather, and found out about pediatric infection rates and eventually umbilical cord catheters. We asked the medical students what those were. They actually weren't sure, so we typed it into Google Images, started seeing pictures of it and understanding how they were currently managed and secured, and then starting seeing pictures of these babies that currently have them. Was really eye-opening. But you're 100% right, David. First time actually stepping into the NICU, seeing how small those babies are, how they're truly being their life is being supported a variety of different ways. It was at Stanford, so there was quite a range of conditions and a wide variation of babies who are in the NICU. So yeah, it was eye-opening just seeing that field of medicine, very different than idiopathic knee osteoarthritis, which is usually in population. But yeah, one of the first things that hit me, kind of with biodesign in my mind and sort of the engineering brain turned on as well, is just how everything was just very arts and craftsy, and everyone had to MacGyver everything. And it was very impressive, honestly, all the things that the nurses did. But I couldn't help but think wow, there is a lot of opportunity here for improvement. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, clinically meaningful part of the hospital without a doubt, but also, compelling and exciting from an engineering perspective.
I do want to come back to the bespoke MacGyvering arts and crafts element. Before we get there, tell me a little bit more about the consequences of catheter migration or even of the original problem that you were seeing or that you were assigned in your course. How does that play out in a patient? What are the consequences when that goes wrong?
Yeah, so great question. I'll start off by saying the sort of key insight, clinically key insight that we uncovered in the course of the class is that these catheters, these umbilical cord catheters, are one of the hospital's only unprotected central lines. Most central lines go into patients sort of parallel to the body. Usually have one catheter that goes in through it. But for an umbilical catheter, it comes out kind of perpendicular, just where the belly button was or where the umbilical cord is freshly cut. So it comes out roughly perpendicular, and it goes through this desiccating piece of tissue in the Wharton's jelly. And you can have two catheters actually insert the same insertion site, or one. And if you have two, they're usually coming out at different periods of time. Any of those one things that would be unique to umbilical cord catheters, but you add them all together, it just makes it very unique. So it made sense that the field in neonatology kind of just used tape because that's all they had, and there was like too many things going on. So it really needed a very specific solution. And indeed, in the course, the need that we identified was all around infections, and we found a good number of studies to support that umbilical cord catheter bloodstream infections are just higher rates than everything else. So consequences of that are dramatic, right? Can be very dangerous for the patient. Payers usually stop reimbursing for a good portion of the care if there's a hospital-acquired infection, which obviously a CLABSI or central line infection is. Good studies suggest that babies with central line-associated bloodstream infections in NICU cost about $90,000 more to treat and will stay in the NICU about a month longer. So those are, very, very clinically impactful. But indeed, infection rates are not super high, even if they're higher than a lot of other central lines. And so, which is why we started turning our attention a little bit more to catheter migration and movement of these catheters. That happens much more frequently, good 30+% of the time, sometimes upwards of 60, depending on the data that you're looking at. And those are dangerous. I mean, these catheters are usually sustaining life for these patients, giving them nutrients or life-saving medication. These babies are, if they're, very premature, cannot feed on their own. So if a catheter migrates inward, it's an infection risk. You can pull the catheter back to correct the position, but you don't want anything that's not sterile, being migrating inward and introducing bacteria potentially into the bloodstream. If it migrates outward, you cannot correct the position. You have to remove the catheter. And so now you no longer have central access. It is difficult to rare to be able to replace an umbilical cord catheter. Not impossible, but usually now you have to put in a peripheral line. And that is much more challenging. You can imagine in like a, 600, 700 gram baby, you're trying to put a catheter into their arm through the vessel without puncturing the other side of the vessel.
And for our audience, a peripheral line is so a central line is a bigger vessel, and a peripheral line is a teeny tiny vessel and a microscopic size for a little neonate baby.
Exactly. And, contrast that to a freshly cut umbilical vessel that's just kind of open and you thread the catheter right through. So needing to replace a migrated umbilical line introduces new risks, new costs for the hospital. And yeah, it's not always the easiest thing to do, but if you do want to do it, you want to be able to do it in a controlled environment before your umbilical line has migrated. There are a bunch of other, more rare complications associated with a migrated umbilical line, pericardial effusions, necrotizing enterocolitis, other things as well that can be very costly and very expensive. But certainly those risks are low, but have been reported.
It sounds like the insight, which is often kind of subtle and elusive, was really right in front of your eyes with these jerry-rigged securement devices.
For sure, yeah, and it's funny when we started developing the project. Obviously, we began finding neonatologists or pediatric surgeons to kind of work with us, become PIs and grants while we were in the university. We approached people that were like in this by design ecosystem, obviously like innovation minded. And we kind of told them like, hey, we're started learning about this field of umbilical cord catheters, and this looks kind of crazy, and indeed is what happens at Stanford and pretty much every other institution in the world. And we want to do something about it. And we heard more than once this comment of, I'm always thinking about like new opportunities, and this has always been, under my nose, and never really thought about trying to kind of revolutionize this. Now, for sure, it's like a small market opportunity, and there are business challenges associated with starting a company around this. But yeah, a compelling clinical need that I think was under a lot of people's noses. But that's the beauty of biodesign, right? Kind of taking a step back and doing kind of ground up needs finding and research, and forcing yourself to take a new perspective on just problems that have been accepted as standard of care.
Yeah. Let's talk about the fun part for a second. Tell me about the process of figuring out what your invention would look like, uh, making prototypes, and I'd love to hear how that worked because I've seen pictures of many prototypes that you and your team put together, and it was not just a single one and done.
Right. Yeah, it was a little bit of an evolution, but it was like discontinuous as well. So
Mm.
our concept, interestingly, like coming out of the course was very simple. It's just kind of like a half dome with a little sort of like protruding nipple that would secure the catheters. And that was pretty much it. And, almost unfair to call it a prototype because of how simple it was, but it seemed to make sense. And we kind of came out of the course that way. I actually remember this is kind of a funny story. A couple months after the course ended, we were trying to continue working on the project. Another engineer on the team and me went to a neonatologist at Stanford and just, pitched him the project, showed him that prototype that I just described, and asked for his thoughts. And I remember he looked at us and he said, "If you develop this, you're going to make everything worse. Please, like, don't develop this product." We're like, "Really?"
Wow.
Yeah. And we didn't really know why. And he's like, "Yeah, infection is going to get worse. You're actually going to promote bacterial growth because there's no airflow. And now you're covering the insertion site. So you're just going to have bacteria growing." And he was totally right. And we had never thought of that problem. The solution, which we actually did not, figure out on the spot, but maybe a couple of days later, is we just need some venting, right? We need some holes in this thing, and probably not just little pinholes. So then, the next thing we identified is that we needed to have sufficient venting in these prototypes. And when we revived the project a couple of years later, we actually did these in vitro studies to figure out, like on petri dishes, to figure out how much venting we needed to make sure that bacteria wasn't actually growing. And that was kind of our first proof of concept study, if you will, to figure out that we could have something shielding the insertion site, maybe not 100%, but enough to prevent people from accidentally touching it while having enough venting to not promote bacterial growth. And once we figured out that we could do that, then, the kind of more engineering parts of like, how do you actually secure these lines? So that happened a couple years after the course had ended because the project sort of died off just because no one had any bandwidth to work on it. And then one of my teammates, actually not me, decided to revive the project, and then I got back more involved. And then we formed kind of a new team with a couple other people, pediatric surgeon, a couple engineers as well that we hired as consultants. And we met, I remember very well, every Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. And we would, do a small kind of brainstorm, and everyone started to develop a prototype. Some developed more prototypes than others, and we would kind of review the prototypes. And 3D printing was a little new at the time. This was probably like 2015, I think. And we started just coming up with different prototypes week by week, testing them. We'd always pick one person who got to play around with it and break the prototype, and just did this very slow but steady iterative process of figuring out how do we protect it, how is it going to open and close around the catheter, how is it going to secure it, how are you going to reverse the securement, how is it going to hold one or two catheters. And you're right, we had dozens or more of prototypes over the following year. But yeah, we eventually designed like a catheter securement rig where I got to test the strength of securement essentially to inform the next design. So it was fun for sure. It was kind of when everyone was working on it part time, and we would just meet once a week and kind of inch the project and inch the design forward.
That's amazing. And how many years at this point was it since the immersion and the idea came to you?
So I took the course in 2012. Good experience through the course, but not too long after the course ended, just no one had bandwidth to continue working on it. We always had in the back of our minds that it was a good idea. Yeah, then I think in 2014 or 2015 is when my teammate kind of came to me. He said, "Hey," it was a medical student, and he said, "Hey, want to kind of revive this? Do you want to help out?" And I was in the thick of my PhD at the time, and I said, "Yeah, it sounds great. I would love to. I don't know how much time I'll have, but I'll come to the meetings and do what I can." And he was really leading the charge at that point and did for a little while. And over the next couple years, his kind of involvement went down a little bit slowly. Mine kind of went up, and then we spun out the project university a couple months after I finished my PhD in January of 2017. So 5 years since the course began is when we spun it out of the university. Now, it was not 5 years of work, but it was about 2.5 years, I think, before of kind of slow and steady work before starting Novonate.
Wow. I have some questions for you about spinning out, but maybe a quick road point before there, or a quick signpost, I guess. At this point, have you been in a patient yet, or still not demoed?
Yeah, no, not at all, actually. We were still very much early benchtop prototyping phase. Yeah, I mean, so like no quality system, not even like real manufacturing. When we spun out of the university, we had like a device that we felt pretty good about, actually, but realized that it was not very easily manufacturable. So we kind of had to do like a redesign to make sure that manufacturing was doable. So our first device went on a patient in January of 2019. Um, and actually, the approach that we took, there was a lot of discussion around this. So this product was a class 1 510(k) exempt device, catheter securement, FDA classifies as class 1 510(k) exempt. So
And just for our audience, do you mind kind of recapping class 1 versus class 3 and
yeah,
class 2? And
yeah. So class 1, 2, 3 FDA classifies devices by lowest to highest risk. So class 1 being the lowest risk, class 3 being the highest risk. And the level of studies or evidence that you have to provide to the FDA sort of scales accordingly. So for class 1 devices, I'm kind of generalizing because there are some kind of class 1 510(k) devices, but for most class 1 devices, including Life Bubble, there are certainly regulatory requirements, things that you have to do to put in place. Then you just inform the FDA that you have done them, and then you can commercialize the product. They don't actually have to review everything. Class 2 devices, there's a process called 510(k) where you show substantial equivalence to something else that has been commercialized, and class 3 is usually when you need what they call pre-market approval of full-scale clinical trials. And so for Life Bubble, it's class 1 510(k) exempt. So we actually did not even need for the US to have like a design history file and a very in-depth technical file, because that's for class 2 devices, what the FDA calls special controls. You only needed general controls, things like quality system, manufacturing controls, things like that. However, we recognize like, hey, we're developing a product for babies in the NICU. And even though it's class 1 device by FDA, we're going to treat it actually as if it's a class 2 device. Now, doesn't mean we're going to file something with FDA. I don't even know if we have a mechanism to do that. But we decided that we were going to have a full design history file and subject it to the special controls that FDA would subject to class 2 devices. And I mean, if nothing else, this would help us, make sure we're designing a good product, have considered all the different risks. And outside the U.S., most other regulatory bodies would require some of those documentation. So we treat it as a class 2 device, even though it's class 1. And then we actually did not put it on a patient, going back to your original question, until we had completed that process and kind of commercialized it from a regulatory perspective. So spun out of the university 2017, kind of redesigned for manufacturability, quality system manufacturing, bumps in the road, et cetera. And then January 2019, I think we registered it December 2018. And in January 2019, the first one went on a patient. And, that was not the version that we have today. We're obviously keeping very close eye on everything, learned some things. The basic, actually, I have one on my desk right here, just by complete coincidence. This was generation 1 of Life Bubble, look like this. So current one is, similar. You'll probably recognize some components of it.
Can you hold that even closer to the camera, Eric?
Go. See that? So it's kind of this wide wings and kind of these small vents, kind of opaque at the top. Actually, the original was even more opaque than this. But this is kind of what it looked like. But yeah, it didn't come with any adhesives. NICU nurses were telling us, kind of, you're taking us halfway there. mixed package adhesive. So we eventually designed like an adhesive pack. We made that top window that I was showing you a lot more transparent than it was on generation one. Then we developed a smaller size over time because smaller babies need a smaller one. Kind of had a revised application and some other components that were improved. Nurses really liked that, so we redesigned the large to mimic the form factor of the small, just kind of get bigger, and then some other kind of changes along the way. So, yeah, first product was in quote unquote commercial use um, in January of 2019, and I don't think we got to sort of what the current offering looks like until 2022, I want to say. Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. So we learned a lot along the way, but a little bit different, right, than class two or class two devices that are doing a lot of pre-commercial sort of clinical testing.
There's so many inflection points here that I'm hearing, and one key moment that I think many startups have in their journey is when you started out in the Stanford ecosystem, and then at some point you made the decision to break out of Stanford, and we call it spinning out. Tell me what went into that decision. How did you know it was time? What were you feeling at the time?
Yeah, great questions. Certainly nerves. I was effectively like a solo founder. I didn't have, a true full-time colleague doing this with me. Learning a lot on the fly, calling a lot of people in the biodesign world to just figure out how to incorporate a company, sign stock, differences between preferred and kind of like all the things. So I felt like I had a lot to learn, but I was learning very quickly. How we knew it was time, I mean, it felt like we were at the point where we needed to really do what companies do, which is like put a quality system together, engage with the manufacturer, start paying for IP, which is I feel like kind of difficult to do in a university setting. We also had spent the previous 6 months trying to find investors and pitching to investors. Myself and then a couple of our advisors, James Well, Ross Vinook, were with me. And yeah, we were entering like these pitch competitions and, writing grants. We went to the pitch competition at the Rosen Institute, actually, which is kind of UCSF's kind of medical device network slash accelerator. And I remember the three of us, we pitched, we gave our pitch, and there was a bunch of judges, a bunch of people in the room. We had no idea who they were. This was in person. And got some questions, answered the questions well. And then one of us, I think it was James to his credit, said, well, if you guys know anyone who would like to invest in our company, let us know. And someone raised their hand and said, well, I would. And we kind of looked at him and had no idea who he was. And we're literally being shuffled out as the next team is being shuffled him. I literally remember asking him for his card. He's like, I don't have a card. And I don't even think we caught his name, but we eventually, through Christine, who ran the Rosen Institute, reconnected with him a few months later, and his name was Radu Kadis. He was the managing director of what became MedTech Venture Partners. So they were starting a new venture fund, a small but medical device focused fund, and they hadn't even created their fund yet. I don't even know if they were incorporated at the time. Um, but we stayed connected with them. They seemed really interested in investing. Of course, they cannot invest in like a university-based team. They need a company to invest in. So it was still, to be honest, not until end of 2017 before they fully invested. But one of their LPs was willing to kind of invest us early to kind of get us going. So it seemed like we had enough to get started. We got a $50,000 grant from this pediatric device consortium in Atlanta. So we just had like a little money that we could start using for things, and it just kind of felt like that was the time and that was the opportunity, and yeah, so we took it, and not knowing, how far it would go and how long it would last, but we had enough of a reason to dive in, and then I was willing to do it, coming out of my PhD and already not making a lot of money, and just kind of see where the next, at the time, next couple of years would take us, but that has now spun off into many more years than that.
Yeah. And James is such an incredible mentor, advisor to so many people in the biodesign community. It's incredible that comment that he made had such an ideal audience in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
A big challenge that that I think about when I think about what you have accomplished with Novonate is the challenge of a small population with an incredibly life altering problem, but a challenge for you talking to investors in terms of the upside. Walk me through how you dealt with that and how you advise people now when they are trying to solve problems that have a small group of patients.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say this is a challenge that the pediatric device community as a whole faces, and there is a growing community of pediatric device innovators that are all like amazing, amazing people. And this is like maybe the number one topic that comes up when we get together through whatever forum. Like I said, we managed to find this budding new venture group that really had a pretty small fund relative to other venture capital fund. So what I tell others who are raising for small market opportunities is you got to find the investors that are accordingly small. There was a time where I was getting ready to raise like a subsequent fund to find new investors, and I was looking at like any venture group that had invested in anything pediatrics or close, but also was well under $100 million fund, which might sound like a lot, but that actually filters out quite a number of venture capitalists. And the smaller their fund, the better, which usually is like, people want big dollars, people that have money. But I knew that the returns that we could potentially offer would only make sense for the funds that didn't have like tons and tons of money to invest. So I think it's a matter of finding investors with whom like this market size could resonate and could appreciate the low technical and clinical risk of getting this to market. So, yeah, I mean, this MedTech Venture Partners, they were our primary investor for the majority of time. We did a bridge round where we got a good number of angels as well. And during that round is all about, telling angels, yeah, yes, this is a smaller market opportunity than maybe anything that you've seen over the last year. But I'm asking for your money to help us commercialize at a later stage. There's a lower risk of dilution than you might be used to in investing in other companies. And to some extent, more than a few of these investors just felt good about supporting pediatric innovation and a field that is largely ignored in the scope of medical technology and startups. So yeah, and valuation obviously matters as well. If you try to look at what the valuations are of other startup companies, ignoring kind of their market opportunity, you're gonna get depressed very quickly. But the valuation has to make sense. So we were very reasonable with our valuation relative to our market opportunity. Frequently would take it from the investor's perspective, like what would make sense for them, why would they invest, and actually James and I remember very well, like very early on, we kind of promised each other that we wouldn't let this endeavor and let this company die simply because like we wanted to dig our heels into like a very high valuation. That would not be the cause of this failure. We stuck to our guns on that, and so yeah, it's a challenge, no doubt about it, but just kind of making sure you don't overraise. And the last thing I say, I know I'm kind of like jumping all over the place in my response to this question, is just finding people in the team who are willing to kind of not only willing to do whatever is necessary for the company, but are actually genuinely excited to fulfill different roles as well. Whether it's hardcore engineering or graphic design or marketing or clinical support. And, everyone who was involved in the company has done many of those things. I mean, I was like fulfilling customer orders myself sometimes up until like up until the acquisition, even a little bit after that as well. And it was just like, hey, we got a couple of orders. The other two people who could fulfill them weren't around. So, all right, I'm coming into the office to make sure they get their orders, filling out with documentation. And so I think, people who probably work in medtech as a whole really value the field that they're working in. And I think that's just especially true in pediatric devices.
Hmm. Eric, and of course, to fast forward now, Life Bubble and Novonate were acquired by Laborie, and I'd love to dig into some of that with you. But it's so interesting talking through this process, how you went from engineer to someone wearing basically every hat, and now you are leading business development for OBGYN and the neonatal space, if I have that correct.
Right.
When was it first clear to you that an acquisition might be in the works? How did that happen?
Yeah, great question. So a little bit after we commercialized Life Bubble and really starting selling it, I don't mean just kind of the first on patient, first on baby, but actually, when we had a sales team, we were kind of getting, recurring revenue, not a lot, but a little bit at least. Our investors and our board, NetTech Venture Partners, kind of came to me and said, Eric, we want you to put together a presentation of any strategic that could possibly acquire this, why they would acquire this, and who the person at that company should be who we should talk to. And so it
Mm.
took some time, but they really imposed that on me, and we had a meeting down the hall from here. So I remember it well. When was this? I don't know. This was probably 2021, I guess. Probably. I know that's COVID time, but I do remember we did it in person. So maybe I got that year a little mixed. But I did that. And the action item from that is we sort of assigned, the board was there and a couple others, sort of assigned every company who they were going to find at that company, the person who had mentioned, uh, set up a meeting with that person. And so we did that. There were maybe probably 10 companies. We didn't get in touch with all of them successfully, but I think most of them. And we had a conversation with them, or I had a conversation with each of them, and started building relationships. And we never knew when it was gonna whether anything was gonna come of it. It was not necessarily our goal to like sell the company in the next 6 months, but start building those strategic relationships. And so, yeah, met people at all these companies. And about every 4 months or so after that, I would just send an update. Hey, these are like the things that we've accomplished in the last 4 months. Would love to tell you more if you'd like to meet. And about half the people at that time would take me up on that, and we'd meet, and I'd talk to them, and they would ask their questions, and I would answer. They'd, express some concerns or whatever, and we just kind of started building those relationships. And things kind of various things kind of progressed through those conversations. It was more than just updates. There was one strategic, actually, we entered like a limited kind of commercial partnership with them. Actually, this was 2021, so that meeting must have happened before that. And it did not go very well, that partnership. Probably doing it in the middle of COVID had a lot to do with it. There were some other details as well. We basically entered like a 6 month kind of limited commercial partnership, but that came of those conversations. The intention was that if it went well, maybe they would acquire, but it did not go well, again, for a variety of reasons. But continued kind of building relationships with others, two other strategics. At one point, it seems like talks were progressing, but then they kind of stalled. But one of those companies that we had spoken a lot to was called Clinical Innovations. And conversations kind of progressed with them at various times. Got to know their director of business development, their head of business development very well. And it felt like we were getting close to maybe something happening then, but then that kind of fell apart. Things went quiet, but then 2 months later, found out that Clinical Innovations was acquired by Laborie. So it's
Mm.
like, okay, interesting. Then, things kind of died off again. That person left the company. I continued kind of my periodic check-ins now with the people at Laborie who were legacy Clinical Innovations. And then eventually, just as we continue to do all we were doing at Novonate, continued development and commercialization of Life Bubble, in mid 2022, things kind of picked up. Some of the people that were on those early calls at Clinical Innovations were in kind of higher positions of power at Laborie. There were new people with whom the story of Novonate was resonating, and things just kind of picked up from there. So, yeah, to answer your question, David, I don't know if I ever knew that like an acquisition was imminent until it started getting really close. Till we signed like an offer sheet, I suppose. But
Wow.
it was something that was, on our mind, board in my mind for a couple years leading up to it.
Wow.
Yeah,
What a story of twists and turns, really.
yeah.
So many different roles that you've played, and we are talking earlier about the different hats you wore. What has changed in your role inside Laborie now compared to being the person running the company, doing fulfillment and all of that?
Yeah. I mean, a fair amount has changed. So, yeah, business development. It's a lot of internal business development. I certainly support the external business development things as well. An investment that we made in NovaCuff a year and a half ago, acquisition of Jada from Organon was announced a week ago, or the intent to acquire, and then, working on completing it. So it's exciting to be involved in those things for sure. still a large part of my job within Laborie is supporting Life Bubble sales. But the biggest thing that feels different is now we have like a real sales team. So we kind of were scrappy in our sales and commercialization. We kind of had these commercialization partners with Novonate that were good, but it was a separate company always, right? Now within Laborie, it's the same company. All the sales reps in the U.S. are like direct 100% Laborie employees. They only sell the Laborie portfolio. So, the effort feels different, and kind of everyone is aligned and on the same page, which is exciting. Certainly going from like a three-ish person company with Novonate to when I joined Laborie, a little under 1,000 is very, very different. Now, 1,000 person company, while it sounds immense by startup standards, is not so big that you can't kind of wrap your arms around like who the leadership is and all that. So it's been exciting for me to kind of have the resources of a bigger organization. Obviously, like the laser focus on one product isn't, how it was with a startup company. But I report to the head of sales and marketing on the OB/GYN division. She kind of heads the whole division. And sort of I'm very squarely on the marketing team, which is a lot of what I was doing with Novonate, but it's been fun being kind of like this engineering minded, startup minded person now on the kind of sales and marketing side of a larger organization, and a big learning experience for sure. But I've been enjoying it. Yeah, it's been what 2.5, coming on 3 years now, actually, in a few months, being with Laborie.
Wow. What's been the biggest surprise since you changed over?
A lot. The biggest surprise, I mean, I guess the challenges that just come with being in like a larger organization in a way. And there's a ton of resources. I very much enjoy not watching the bank account every single day, which is great. Um, there are a lot of people who are experts in their sort of little field within Laborie, but it's a little bit hurting cats sometimes with a larger organization getting one project to move forward. But it's exciting nonetheless, and so it's been exciting. I don't know if to call it surprising, but exciting just kind of watching Life Bubble grow, exponentially since the Novonate days, and being on calls with customers pretty regularly, getting name recognition. Only recently does it feel like we go to conferences and people know about Life Bubble and heard about it. And, you know, um, for the longest time, it was like this new product that we were introducing people to, but now people know about it. And so now we get to take the next step in getting them to try it out, to use it, to implement it.
Eric, I always like to ask people what their advice is to someone who lacks the resources and maybe the community that wants to get involved in innovation. And you've had such a unique path to where you are now. What would you tell that person?
Um, Peer support really is, I think, what it's all about. And, the community of startups, I think, is strong, and you have to find your way into it. And, what I've found, most entrepreneurs, especially in medical technology, want to help each other out. And,
Mm.
it is uncommon, I think, for there to be like direct competition between startups. Not to say it doesn't happen. Of course, it happens sometimes. But I think people are very, very willing to share their experiences, share their advice, lean on, their success and failures. And to give a specific example for Novonate, I synced up pretty early with Kate Garrett, who ran CL Medical, and she also kind of had a smallish size company. Um, and she gave me a ton of fantastic advice. And I quickly realized that I just needed to like copy her playbook. I hired the same quality people she had hired, implemented a very similar kind of strategy as her, and picked her brain a lot as we sort of progressed. And she learned a lot and failed in certain ways, and was very honest about what those things were, the good people to hire, the people to stay away from. And I just leaned on her advice and expertise. And I've tried my best to pay it forward as well to a lot of other companies, and obviously had my own learnings along the way. So yeah, to answer your question, it is difficult, but you don't have to always learn by your own failures. You can learn by other people's failures because they're very willing to share those things, I find.
Wow. Well, Eric, this has been such a special conversation. I'd love to know where you would like people to go to learn more about you and what you're doing.
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about Life Bubble, you can go to Laborie's website. Obviously, Life Bubble is up there, and if you're a clinician who wants to learn more about the product, can certainly reach out to us through there. You'll very quickly find your way to me through the product page. Otherwise, anyone is more than welcome to find me on LinkedIn, send me messages there, and happy to share more about the story, especially if you're in the world of pediatric devices, or in the broader field of women's health and labor and delivery, which is a big part of what I do. I know we didn't talk a lot about that today, but I spend a good amount of my time thinking about that too with Laborie. So feel free to find me and happy to chat.
And I'll have all of that information linked up in the description, so anyone who's listening on their device right now can just click it and go. Well, Eric, thank you so much for talking to me today, and this is just such a joy.
Yeah, thank you, David, for having me. I really appreciate it. Nice chatting with you.
You too.